freedom of speech, freedom of expression is essential to a democratic country such as our own. And it is a responsibility of every individual citizen to know that, to consider that, and if necessary, to police that.
I don't believe in muting groups, but ultimately, if you're vilifying a group or vilifying a type of person, then I don't believe that it should all be permitted.
Your free speech doesn't guarantee you from the consequences of maybe your views being too extreme for your employer. Everyone who works anywhere has to follow a code of conduct or they get fired.
I'm sorry, but the world has shifted to this side, and conservative views are not only suppressed, they're not being heard, and they're not being appreciated.
From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, the Zoomer with Marissa Semkiw.
Welcome to the Zoomer. I'm Marissa Semkiw. Last year, you'll recall Canadians were gripped by an incident at Wilfrid Laurier University, where Lindsay Shephard was reprimanded as a teaching assistant for neutrally playing a clip of U of T professor Jordan Peterson discussing trans pronoun usage. The incident provoked a debate in academia and elsewhere on freedom of expression and just how free it should be. Where this tension manifests itself is in the limiting of debate if the speaker or the content of the debate is upsetting to people. Today, we'll discuss this conflict between free speech and freedom from offense, and we'll also consider the implications of the Ontario government's new free speech directive to universities and colleges. At the round table, I'm pleased to welcome journalists and activists, constitutional experts and lawyers. But before we dive in, let's tee up the topic.
So what started the furor this year was Lindsay Shephard, a graduate student at Wilfrid Laurier University, whose attempt to bring two sides of a point of view to a class in communications that she was teaching ended up in her being interrogated in a kind of star chamber scene that she recorded. It went public, and everybody suddenly realized when they heard the words of her interrogators, her supervising professor, the equity officer at her school, they lambasted her.
Okay, so what I have a problem with is I didn't target anybody. Who did I target? Trans folks. How? By telling them ideas that are really out there? By telling them that? By telling them? Really?
It's not just telling them. In legitimizing this as a valid perspective, as this is another valid perspective.
In a university, all perspectives are valid.
That's not necessarily true.
Well, this is something that's being debated in current society, and I don't feel the need to shield people from what's going on in society.
She was showing a clip from a public affairs television show with both sides.
What is it you find offensive about this legislation?
Well, fundamentally, there were two things that really bothered me, although there have been other things I've thought about since. One was that I was being asked, as everyone is, to use a certain set of words that I think are the constructions of people who have a political ideology that I don't believe in and that I also regard as dangerous.
What are those words?
Those are the made-up words that people now describe as gender neutral. And so, to me, they're an attempt to control language.
When you listen to those professors, they're willing to destroy her life over that. And if you listen to the sort of gobbledygook they talk, all that, it's problematic to show a clip of Jordan Peterson, then that's exactly the way, if you look at any of the great novels of Eastern Europe, Milan Kundera, The Joke, when the commissars haul him up for telling a joke that does not meet with party approval, that's what these guys are doing. And they're too historically ignorant to know that they're the totalitarians.
You can't say that is one thing, and you must say that is another. And I don't know what's worse, but I think it's sometimes worse to compel speech. We've had Bill C-16, which compels you to use made-up pronouns.
Now, Elijah, you are the founder and president of U Ottawa Students for Free Speech. Would you say that what occurred with Lindsay Shephard is an accurate subset of the types of things that are occurring on university campuses?
For sure. I mean, like, frequently these rules that they create to mitigate what they call hate and harassment really just end up being used to silence people of dissenting viewpoints. We saw it at Wilfrid Laurier. We saw it again at University of Toronto. I mean, that just appears to be the case. Like, they try to make it sound like it's neutral and it's just used to stop people from being uncomfortable or from being harassed. But in the end, really, it just comes out to them silencing dissenting viewpoints.
Sue-Ann, where are you on this? Are we seeing an erosion of academic freedom and free expression, not just on campuses, but in Canada more broadly?
Absolutely. I think that if you're a conservative commentator, then you have no freedom of speech. And I found that I have, you know, expressed very strong viewpoints and been called variously a racist, an Islamophobe, a self-loathing lesbian. I don't know how that is possible.
Arjuna, where do you stand on this sort of pendulum swing between free speech and freedom?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I think I'm very glad we're framing this debate in the context of academia, because I almost want to address it, as I hope an academic would, by questioning the question. So one of the sort of narratives of this very fraught, very current debate is the idea that there is a crisis, right? Where it seems to a lot of people that there's this real crisis about free speech, especially on universities. And I actually took a moment to try to explore the data around this, because it's really important, if we feel strongly about something, that we should see if it's backed by evidence. And from what I found, actually, both in the US and Canada, there isn't very much concrete data that shows that this crisis is actually occurring.
Well, we have Lindsay Shephard. We have a number of incidences.
Well, it's great that you bring up the Lindsay thing, because apart from a verbal reprimand that was later retracted, an apology that was issued by the Laurier University, I'm not sure what she actually suffered in terms of a lasting consequence. In fact, she's been able to sort of launch a very successful career based on this incident, right? So yeah.
Well, how about instances where speeches are shut down? Individuals come to speak on university campuses, and they're prohibited from doing so.
Yeah, so it turns out, from the research that I've done, I've only found 3 examples in the last 8 years of speakers at universities being canceled. Faith Goldie in 2018, Faith Goldie in 2017, and Ann Coulter in 2010. And the very interesting thing about this is they were not actually shut down because the universities themselves had problems with their content. They were shut down because they actually were unable to guarantee the safety of everyone involved.
I'd like you to talk to Hen Mazik. Hen Mazik is an Israeli advocate and activist. He travels around the world and speaks to university campuses. He was taken off the campus in Victoria College in London, England, because they did not want him to speak. The pro-Palestinian group did not want him to speak.
Who would they be? Sorry, I just
the pro-Palestinian
group. Was it
group.
the university, or was it the student group?
Students.
Did they forcibly remove him?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
They were banging on the windows. They took him out. The police took him out in an overcoat to hide him. Hen Mazik is coming to university campuses in North America this October, and I suspect that will happen. It happened at Berkeley. It happened at many campuses around the world, in Chicago as well.
Can I just jump in here for 1 minute?
Sure.
What are the safeguards against bad ideas that are put forward publicly in a country like ours? What do you do if somebody says something that you really object to, possibly because you find it hateful or in some other way unpalatable? Well, one thing you can do is ignore it. Another thing you can do is make fun of it. A third thing you can do is explain eloquently why it's wrong and what is correct. These are the rational responses in a civilized, educated country to this kind of thing. Not laws that try and stop it, not university administrations that try and stop it, but an educated, engaged citizenry that recognizes this stuff for what it is. When I went to university, a long, long time ago now, a wise man said to me, at universities, they only teach you one thing, but it's a very important thing. They teach you to distinguish between a good argument and a bad argument. Well, one of the ways you learn to distinguish between good arguments and bad arguments is hearing bad arguments and recognizing them for that. So I think both in a democratic country such as our own and in the universities in a democratic country, there's virtually no place for any kind of control, direct or indirect, of what is said.
And yet it's happening, though.
It is happening, and I regret it deeply, and I think the possible consequences are very severe, dangerous, frightening even.
Okay, there's more to come. Don't go away.
Hate speech is one of those terms that could mean anything to anybody. They say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Hate speech is in the ear of the listener.
Welcome back. We've been discussing the limits of freedom of speech on school campuses and in Canada. It's worth reminding viewers that Canadians do not enjoy a universal right to unlimited freedom of speech. Section 319 of the Criminal Code holds that it is illegal to willfully promote hatred against an identifiable group based on color, race, religion, ethnic origin, age, sex, sexual orientation, mental or physical disability, or gender identity or expression. The latter two, gender identity and expression, were the terms added by Prime Minister Trudeau's now infamous Bill C-16. Now, Philip, I'm going to ask you to expound on this because so much of this debate boils down to, is it hate speech? Is it not hate speech? Can I say that? Can I say that? You know, and I would ask, if the statements are truthful, and they're an expression of religious opinion, are they exempt from hate speech? So,
well, let me just again back up a little bit. I mean, hate speech is one of those terms that could mean anything to anybody. I mean, they say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Hate speech is in the ear of the listener. What's hate speech for one person is not for another. So that's an inherent difficulty with a term like that used in a legal context. It doesn't, in my opinion, advance the debate or advance the issue very far.
Because it's open to such interpretation.
Well, it's the kind of thing that politicians love, right?
So particularly the word struck.
Yeah. The kind of thing that politicians love, particularly the words that you pointed out were added by our current Prime Minister. I mean, it's politically good, it's great, it sounds wonderful, but what does it actually do? How can you actually act on that provision in the Criminal Code? I'll point out for you, by the way, that a private individual cannot prosecute anybody or bring a legal action against anybody under the Criminal Code. That's left for the government to do that. So I would say to you, in a sense, it doesn't matter a whole lot what hate speech means. I have no idea what it means. But even having that provision doesn't advance the issue really very much.
You know, the direction that university campuses are taking is not fixing it, is not.
I agree.
What evidence do you have other than anecdotes? Other than anecdotes,
well,
what evidence
a number of stories.
Evidence that there is this crisis, that things are being eroded.
I'll give you another example. And these are stories I've covered.
Data or anecdote?
I'm not
the most
data.
Thing.
I cover these events. I covered an event with Ezra Levant at Ryerson. He was speaking about anti-Semitism on campus. And this was just last year. And a whole group of students stood outside the door calling him the same names they call me, racist, Islamophobe, with signs. And they blew a blowhorn, a foghorn, to try and drown him out. 6 police were there. And then they worked their way into the room. Ezra, being the brave guy he is, stood up against them and managed to get them out of the room. They would not even allow him to speak. He did speak, but a condensed version of his speech. And this is happening repeatedly with conservative speakers.
Elijah, I want to bring you in here. What do you make of all this?
As I was going to say, there actually are quite a few events. I believe the idea that there isn't that many events is absurd. There absolutely isn't that many events at the university directly between the student unions. There's many events. For example, just last year at our student union, our pro-life club was banned just unilaterally with no sort of consultation whatsoever, simply because the student union believed that it didn't agree with their mandate, basically. And then a month later, they passed a motion saying that the student union is now officially pro-choice and all pro-life groups must be banned. And also they did the exact same thing a couple months later with the campus Jewish group, the Hillel Club. So the Hillel Club was just banned, no sort of warning whatsoever, no good reason for banning them whatsoever, because the university has a very strong pro-Palestine position. They want to push that.
One interesting observation that occurs to me is this, that this is one of these debates about freedom of speech where it doesn't seem to matter very much whether you're on the right, as perhaps some of the people around this table are, or whether you're on the left, as I am. Most issues I'm left of center. We all seem to converge with the same feeling that for whatever reason, no matter what our political point of view, shutting down the expression of opinions we don't like, which generally means opinions contrary to ones we hold, is not a good thing.
While I do advocate for freedom of speech, ultimately, I mean, if it's not responsible and it's not, you know, something that's within the public interest and can be justifiably so, then I don't believe in muting groups. But ultimately, it needs to be responsible.
But if it's in the interest of the public, does that really matter when it comes to freedom of speech?
It is, because, I mean, ultimately, how is it affecting the public that they need to know about this type of speech? I mean, it depends how far you take it. If you're vilifying a group or vilifying a type of person, then I don't believe that it should all be permitted.
There's a certain lack of reality to some of this discussion, because what we haven't touched on, and perhaps you don't want to, I don't know, is the influence of social media. I mean, all of this is transformed by social media. Sue Ann is a traditional journalist, and I have a huge respect for traditional journalists. They've been the cops on the beat for a long time. Unfortunately, they're leaving the beat in vast numbers. What's replacing that? Social media, which has transformed the debate, so-called, around all these issues. Reputations can be destroyed overnight. Issues can be blown up to huge proportions overnight, often by people who don't even really understand what's involved. So it's all different now, in my opinion, in a very bad, dangerous way.
I'm glad you brought that up, Philip, because I'm in the trenches and I have lived experience. And so, first of all, there's a tremendous degree of cyberbullying on social media against people like me, conservative commentators, who have a point of view that may be different. Just let me continue.
Please.
The other thing is that they're very adept at getting the word out. And on August the 12th at Nathan Phillips Square, I covered a rally. It was supposed to be a rally against the neo-Nazis. They didn't show. Antifa types showed up. I was identified because they're very good at getting the word out, screamed at me, called me a racist. They knew my name, and they slugged my photographer. So this is what's happening, to shut us down, to intimidate us, and it's disgraceful.
Yeah, and it's a new platform for people, right, to express views, social media.
Yeah.
And anybody can get up on that platform and express any view.
Isn't
and
that,
the word got out very quickly.
Now. As a freedom of speech advocate, is there no freer speech than the internet? So if the problem that you guys seem to be having, especially you with the internet, is one of the other sides of free speech, which is that freedom of speech doesn't guarantee freedom from the consequences of that speech. And I think the harder thing, especially for people, I'm playing my age card, who might be a little bit older, is that it moves so fast.
You have no idea what being a bit older is.
Yeah, I'm older than I look, but
you have no idea.
But I have to say that is the thing. And on the flip side, and Sue, and I really regret what happened to your cameraman. That sucks. But
yeah.
I also think that a huge problem, as someone on the left side of the spectrum, and is that the cyberbullying of people, anyone who criticizes Jordan Peterson, Faith Goldy, all of these sort of very controversial conservative figures, there is like an army.
It's a mob mentality.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I'd like to think maybe we could agree on that.
It's a mob mentality.
But remember, if the goal is freedom of speech, short of anything that is criminal, right, you might have to deal with getting yelled at.
Okay, when we come back, the Ontario government tells colleges and universities develop free speech policies or face funding cuts. We'll discuss after the break.
Everyone that was quote-unquote shut down, it more actually had to do with safety and security. And the question is a university...
No, you know what? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I got to jump in here. That is total BS.
Welcome back. In 2014, the University of Chicago released a report on free expression, which has come to be called the Chicago Statement. In it, the university argues that the school's, quote, fundamental commitment is to the principle that debate or deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought by some to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed, end quote. This statement has since been adopted or endorsed by dozens of American universities, and most recently by the Ontario Premier. Ontario colleges and universities must come up with free speech policies consistent with the principles contained in the Chicago Statement by January 1, 2019, or will face funding cuts. Now, I'll open it up for discussion. Concerns, praise for the government's announcement. Elijah, why don't I start with you?
Well, first of all, I helped inform it. I was there the same day earlier. I composed this document here. I have it with me. Free Speech Ontario Universities. It's about a 50-page document documenting every single free speech incident for the past 5 years, whether it was from the university, student union. It documented the external groups like Canadian Federation of Students and OPIRG that affect the state of free speech on campus. And well, I believe that if the university is going to be a public institution that is funded by public funds, then it must act according to its mandate. And its mandate is to provide a space where people can have open discussion and dialogue, intellectual discussion, to come to reasonable and informed conclusions. And if the university isn't doing that, then Ford's government has every right to threaten them with taking funding away from them so that they can follow their mandate.
Sarita, this would therefore mean that someone like Jordan Peterson, or even Faith Goldie for that matter, would have the right to come and speak on campus and not be shut down. Do you agree or disagree with the government's directive?
Well, I think in a university setting, it's important that there is expression there. But again, my point of view is it's not so much the expression, it's the substance of the expression. So as long as the information that's being disseminated is to educate and to inform the public, then I don't see an issue with it.
That's a wishy-washy answer. I want a yes or a no. Well, a yes or a no.
Yes, no, I think
it's a good thing.
I think it is a good thing.
But earlier
yes.
you did say that there is some speech that has no place on
yes.
campus.
Yeah, there is if it becomes defamatory. It just depends. So, I mean, an example of that would be, you know, anti-Muslim rhetoric. And so, I think that looking at that, if it's tied into defaming someone that essentially has worked very hard to build their reputation in Canadian society, and then tied into that is hate speech, then I think it becomes an issue for me.
I think this would guarantee, and Philip, I'll go to you, I think this would guarantee that someone who is going to speak ill of Islam would have a right to speak.
You know, again, I'm going to back up. Okay, my favorite thing to do. There's an incredible irony to this, and it's kind of a pathetic irony when the government is telling universities that free speech is important. There was a time when the universities told the government that free speech was important, but apparently this is reversed. When the government of Doug Ford tells the University of Toronto that they better be careful and respect free speech, I mean, what kind of world has it come to?
Concerns?
Oh, totally. First of all, in fact, the director of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University, James L. Turk, has actually spoken out against this and says that it was completely unnecessary. I've read all the free speech policies of Canadian universities or Toronto-based universities prior to this law coming out, and there's nothing in them that actually contradicts what that law says. If we're going to frame this debate correctly, everyone that was quote-unquote shut down, it more actually had to do with safety and security. And the question is a university...
That's not necessarily true.
You know what?
I'm
sorry. I'm sorry. I got to jump
fact.
in here.
That's
That is total BS. I think that that tying money, funding to this, you can talk about all the policies you want in the world, but my lived experience, not research, lived experience, is that they don't follow these policies. They have beautiful policies, they say all these things, they talk about safe spaces. The bottom line is that for many, university campuses are not a safe space. So when you tie money, the dollars, and I'm all for this policy because you tie funding, and I was advocating for it, then that makes them stand up and do something.
Money's actually already involved.
Do you want a government,
and not virtue signal.
Do you want a government bureaucrat deciding whether or not some professor at the University of Toronto or your university
because they can't police themselves. They cannot police themselves.
That may be true, but it doesn't follow from the fact that they are not able to police themselves that this job should now be taken over by a government department. There's a lot of danger in that.
So you think that free speech is under attack on campuses, but you don't want the government sticking its nose in it?
I think historically, the biggest enemy of free speech has been government. And I think to give government the responsibility for monitoring the expression of free speech and insisting that it happen, you know, I mean, the program was prefaced with a quotation by Moses Znaimer from George Orwell's Animal Farm. You know, and that is what you're talking about. Big Brother will be watching you in the form of the government Department of Free Expression.
If I may, I really want to take up Sue's point about money. It's really, really important. The reason actually why these universities didn't allow these talks to happen is their security budgets couldn't handle the ability to allow for this to happen, right? So it's actually, it wasn't, again, about an ideological thing, oh, we don't like this person's ideas, we're shutting it down. It was, this person is saying things that are so abhorrent and controversial that we cannot guarantee their safety with the funds available to us.
I was in Ezra's talk.
Important.
I was in Ezra Levant's talk, I covered it. And there were 6 police officers, and there was security, and there were people beating drums and blowing their foghorns. He said nothing. Absolutely nothing controversial.
Your
no, he didn't.
That's your
he
opinion.
did not.
Yeah.
He did not.
Either way, freedom of speech would allow him, if we were to look at freedom of speech, unlimited freedom of speech, it would allow him that opportunity to say exactly what it is he wants to say.
But again, it's about allowing versus a platform, right? Allowing, just, okay, go on a street corner and say what you want to say. All good. Platform employs the allocation of resources.
Come on, if you deny someone a platform, you deny them the ability to say what they want to say.
There are platforms all over.
They're not
It doesn't necessarily have to be a university paying for someone
there are
to
many
be,
people in our audience
right?
who probably don't agree with what you say, but I've given you a platform to say it.
Yeah, I know.
So shouldn't everyone else have that same right?
I wish everyone had their own TV show. I mean, we kind of do with like YouTube, but you know, like the point is, it's the platform thing is germane to this discussion, because does a university is obligated? I think the costs were approaching 6 figures for the security costs for some of these speakers, right?
Right.
That's money that could be allocated to other things.
But that's only because the university did not handle it properly. I'm sorry.
Costs aside, let me go back to you, Philip, because you still haven't really answered my question. If the government doesn't step in and mandate free speech on school campuses, and based on what you've said, I think you'd like there to be unlimited free speech on campuses. What do we do about it?
Well, I go back, I mean, this may seem romantic and idealistic to you, I don't know, but I go back to something I said earlier on, which is that the best guarantee of free speech, appropriate free speech in a country, is a well-educated, alert citizenry that pays attention. That's the best thing. You don't rely on the police, you don't rely on a government department, you don't rely on a university bureaucrat, you rely on the good sense of a well-educated, discerning citizenry. Somebody will say, you know what, that's wrong. And here's why it's wrong. I'm going to tell you why it's wrong. That's what you want to have happen. And once you take that away, once you wrap the whole issue with all kinds of rules and bureaucrats and decisions and policies, then you're, in fact, removing that responsibility from the citizen. It's the responsibility of all those people sitting over there, each one of them, to pay attention to debate and decide what's right and what's wrong and how they feel about it.
So, Philip, it sounds like you'd actually be in favor of the government scrapping the hate speech laws, based on what
No,
you're
that's
saying.
a complete non sequitur.
Is it though?
I mean, you've gone from one thing to a totally different
because you
remote
seem
thing.
to be saying that the only bulwark against this
I didn't
is...
say the only bulwark. I said that at the end of the day,
Right.
that is a fundamental requirement that you must have.
So
in
do
order
you
to have a free
believe that we
society.
should have federal hate speech laws?
I'm not going to answer that question. It's a trap.
Okay, when we come back, what the future looks like for free speech in Canada. Don't go away.
I think it's something only like 47% of students, I think I read, that actually think freedom of speech is the most important thing in a democracy. And we know from polls that students no longer think that freedom of speech is the most important value. That really has gone down. I think it's something only like 47% of students, I think I read, that actually think freedom of speech is the most important thing in a democracy.
Nobody under a certain age even bothers paying lip service to it anymore, and more people are quite explicit that identity group politics and theories of identity groups override freedom of speech. So you can have freedom of speech, but it shouldn't extend to transgender issues or gay. So of course I'm in favor of freedom of speech, but I don't think this guy should be able to say he doesn't believe in same-sex marriage. Okay, so so you're in favor of freedom of speech except for gay stuff. Oh well, no. Also, I don't think you should be able to say that Islam's got something to do with terrorism. So okay, so it's just gays and Islam. Oh well, no. Wait a minute. I think transgendered pronoun. Okay, so now it's the and by the time you actually, I mean, it's killed so many areas of life. It's fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating to me to watch the terrible state of comedy, for example, and that's basically because you can't actually make 90% of life. You can't make jokes about now.
All right, welcome back. That was National Post columnist Barbara Kay and conservative political commentator Mark Steyn at this year's Idea City Conference talking about the state of free speech in Canada. According to a new study, college students value a diverse and inclusive environment more than free speech rights. The report from Gallup and the Knight Foundation found that 53% of students interviewed for the study picked diversity versus 46% who chose freedom of speech.
Ooh.
Now, Arjuna, I'm going to ask you to comment, A, on those numbers, but
yeah.
B, to Mark Steyn's point, is I support free speech, but, oh, I don't like you to say that, and you can't say this, and you can't say that, but, oh, I'm a free speech proponent.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Phil, even said, there is a line, right? There's a line, we have hate speech laws. Getting back to that, those statistics, thank you for sharing numbers with me. I appreciate that. And yeah, that's really interesting because I think it gets to a fundamental question about free speech, and which is, at what point, and this is one of the beautiful questions about democracy, right, is at what point do freedoms start to infringe on other freedoms, right? That is sort of the fundamental question of political philosophy, right? And the idea that we're talking about diversity and inclusiveness, sort of quote-unquote trumping free speech, can actually be looked at in a more nuanced way, which is, at what point does speech, the pronoun debate being a very fraught one right now, actually harm people? And at what point does the freedom of someone to use a way of addressing someone that is hurtful and offensive impact on their rights as a citizen and as someone who's able to participate in our democracy?
But then that goes to the question, how do you value speech? Is it based on the content of the speech, or is it based on the very principle enshrined in Canada's Constitution?
Well, I mean, I think the principle has no substance unless you talk about the content. So, I mean, it is all about content. And my view, as I guess has perhaps become clear by now, is that almost any content, not any content, but almost any content is fine. And the way you deal with the problems that may generate, and it may well generate problems, as we've been discussing, is not through suppression, not through rules, not through policies, but in other ways.
The problem is, you've got impressionable kids on campus, probably many of them first time away from home. They hear these words from professors. They know those professors have the power to fail them or pass them. So when you say people should use their reason, it's not like telling the people in this audience to use their reason. It's telling impressionable young students who are fed this line of sometimes ridiculous nonsense, particularly for some of these professors, and are not fed the other side, are not provided the other side. And that concerns me.
I take your point, but if I can just make one comment on it. Again, in a sense, this has to do with education. My point is, rather than say, oh, well, these are tender, young, impressionable minds in university, let's back into the educational system. Let's back into high school, and let's make these tender minds not quite so impressionable. Let's give them the knowledge and the tools
well, now
they
you're talking
need
about school
to be
boards.
Discerning.
Yeah,
so
now
basically
you're talking
to make them a little more resilient when they go out.
Yeah, I mean, the wonderful thing about going to university is when the professor, certainly when I did, when the professor says something, you say, well, why do you say that? I don't really agree with it. Explain it to me.
Elijah, I see you nodding your head there.
There's a reason students don't value speech, and it's because the impressionable ones, at least, they're taught over and over again that speech is oppressive. It's like, a white male construct made to oppress minority groups. It's absurd. It doesn't really surprise me that this is what people believe.
Sarita, to Sue-Ann's point, when one side of the debate is suppressed, people aren't given the freedom to think for themselves. Earlier you mentioned there's some speech that's just intolerable. It's too intolerable. Hate speech aside, it's too intolerable to be discussed. But to her point, when one side of the debate is completely suppressed, then how are people able to think for themselves?
No, I understand that viewpoint, but I feel like, you want to have a platform for groups to express themselves. And then on the other hand, there's that dichotomy of, well, it can border sometimes on hate speech, and then you end up suppressing those same groups that you want to give that platform to express themselves. So I think this is where, this is where we have to be cautious, in the sense that while it's recommended that we do have this freedom of expression, that ultimately we don't want to suppress other groups in the process.
And to piggyback on that, the university is not the only platform. There are so many ways to get your ideas out. That's a beautiful thing about the world we live in today, right? And the irony is, for the Jordan Petersons and the Faith Goldies of the world, is they've actually been made they're deliberately sort of capitalizing.
Oh, stop! That doesn't matter. She wanted to give a speech at Laurier University,
totally
and someone pulled the fire
alarm,
alarm, and she wasn't able to speak.
But the point is that again, it's a narrative where there's a narrative being constructed, I think, that is being seized upon, and when there really isn't a crisis. Again,
Sorry.
Yeah.
I totally disagree. The narrative is indeed true, and I have been suppressed myself. And just actually dumped from a radio station yesterday for my conservative views after 15 years.
It doesn't free
So
speech.
don't tell me that it's not being suppressed.
People get fired for reasons all the time. Your free speech doesn't guarantee you from the consequences of maybe your views being too extreme for your employer. Everyone who works anywhere has to follow a code of conduct or they get fired.
I'm sorry, but the world has shifted to this side, and conservative views are not only suppressed, they're not being heard, and they're not being appreciated.
Okay, when we come back, we'll hear from the audience. Don't go away.
Well, I am opposed to hate speech, but I'm just as much opposed and categorically opposed to someone else deciding what hate speech is. And in a democracy, the question is, how do you sort that out?
Welcome back. It's that time in the show when we hear from the audience. What's your question, sir?
Well, it's very simple. I am opposed to hate speech, but I'm just as much opposed and categorically opposed to someone else deciding what hate speech is. And in a democracy, the question is, how do you sort that out?
And I think the ultimate responsibility for sorting it out, as you put it, is on you and on every individual to decide for themselves, according to standards that they think are appropriate, what is hate speech or not.
Hey, Max, actually, I have a question for you based on your question. What do you think the speed limit should be on the 401? No, like it's the same idea, right? Because everyone has their own idea of what that should be. I'm a 120 guy. It's not working out super well for me. But what happens is when we have something that where is a line, everyone's got a different opinion on the line, and it works out to public safety on one side and efficiency and ease of transport on the other side, right? And that's where we can find lines as a democratic society, is it's always a balancing act, right? And again, I wish it was 120, but a lot of research and data and experience has shown that that's not safe. So we have it at 100.
I would say the pendulum has swung so far that someone has to step in, and the universities are not stepping up to the plate. I am so tired of the drivel that they provide to me, and the virtue signaling, silly words that they provide when they don't act on their actual policies, that somebody has to step in. They're not accepting responsibility for what's happening.
Yeah. I just want to say something quickly about your analogy. I think it's a faulty analogy.
Okay.
With respect to safety on the highway, there are objective ways of sorting out what that should be. With respect to the other kind of safety, that ends up being very subjective.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm offended, therefore I'm not safe. Well, you know, that's...
It's very nuanced, that it takes time. It's not easy.
I agree with my friend on the right here. Everyone should take care of their own safety with respect to speech.
All right. When we come back, final thoughts, stay tuned.
On Facebook, Eva writes, "Freedom of speech is not freedom from consequences. I may not like what someone says, but they have every right to say it." Keep the comments coming in, and don't forget to log on to www.thezoomertv.com for full episodes and more.
Welcome back. Well, in the final time we have, we'll hear some final thoughts from the panelists, starting to my left, Arjuna.
Yeah, so I think that, as I said before, change is scary, especially, you know, a lot of our viewers are older, and a lot of this narrative about sort of freedom of speech and diversity and stuff is, I think, driven by resistance to change, and change has never been easy. When we look back on change, we think it was easy and through rose-colored glasses, but change is hard and involves hard questions like the ones we're discussing, and I think it's really important to keep an open mind about everything that we're saying.
Freedom of speech, freedom of expression is essential to a democratic country such as our own. And it is a responsibility of every individual citizen to know that, to consider that, and if necessary, to police that. It's not the responsibility of universities, governments, human rights commissions or anybody else. It's the responsibility of all of us to do that.
In the end, I'm pleased with the direction the Ford government has taken with protecting freedom of speech in Ontario, and I guess given that what's happening in universities is now finally starting to get exposed, I'm a bit more optimistic about the future of speech in Canada, because it really is, like you said, one of our fundamental values.
I think a very dangerous precedent has been set, that you talk about change. It's not change for the better, it's change for the worse. And I think conservative voices are being suppressed, both south of the border and here in Toronto. And there is a mob mentality that has developed that tries to intimidate, bully, do whatever, call one names, racist and Islamophobe, the old tropes, to shut down conservative viewpoints. And I feel very strongly about it. I've experienced it, and I think it's really sad.
Sarita?
I believe in the fundamental value of freedom of speech. However, I think that when it borders on defamation and libel, I think that's where we need to be cautious. Justice Nakatsuru, in a recent case where a motion was brought to dismiss a defamation case, he said clearly, and I'm going to just read it out, he said expression is important. However, the public must have a genuine stake in knowing about the expression, how it legitimately encompasses matters in science, politics, arts, morality, religion, and the environment. So I think if that expression is founded on that basis, then, again, it's important for it to be discussed and disseminated. But again, it has to be responsible communications, is my opinion.
Okay, well, thank you to my panelists for being here and to the audience for watching. That's all the time we have. We'll see you next time. Time to zoom out.